At a tense family dinner, my sister-in-law suddenly accused me, "You stole my wallet." For 3 years, my sister-in-law had made it her mission to make me feel like I did not belong in the family, and what made it worse was how expertly she disguised every insult behind a smile so polished that no one else seemed willing to see the sharpness beneath it. From the very beginning, she had this way of looking at me that felt less like seeing and more like measuring, as if she had already decided I was unworthy and was simply waiting for everyone else to catch up. Every family gathering became a quiet battlefield for me. She never screamed, never openly insulted me in a way anyone could call out, but she didn't need to. Her words were always wrapped in silk. If I spoke about my work, she would tilt her head and say something like, "It must be nice to sit behind a computer all day while real people handle real responsibilities," and then laugh lightly as if it were a joke. When my husband and I bought our home, a place I had worked tirelessly to help afford, she walked through it with those same blade-thin smiles and said, "It's cozy. I suppose not everyone has an eye for quality." Every remark was designed to cut just deep enough to leave a mark only I could feel. The worst part was that whenever I tried to explain it to the rest of the family, they dismissed me. My husband would sigh and tell me I was reading too much into things. His parents would insist that she had a difficult sense of humor. Even his brother, her husband, would chuckle and say that was just how she was. Somehow I was always the problem for noticing. I was the one accused of being sensitive, dramatic, unable to take a joke, so I learned to keep quiet. I smiled through dinners, birthdays, anniversaries, and holidays, swallowing every humiliation because I loved my husband, and because I kept hoping one day someone would finally see what she was doing. But deep down, I knew she was escalating. It wasn't enough for her to belittle me in subtle ways anymore. I could feel something worse building beneath the surface, like the air before a storm. The breaking point came on a Sunday evening at a family dinner hosted at my in-laws' house. It was supposed to be an ordinary gathering, one of those weekly dinners everyone insisted were important for family bonding, though for me they had long become exercises in endurance. I arrived with my usual tote bag slung over my shoulder, carrying my phone charger, lipstick, notebook, and a few work files I needed for Monday. The house was already buzzing with conversation, and the smell of roasted chicken and spices filled the air. She greeted me at the door with a smile so perfect it made my skin crawl. "So glad you could make it," she said, emphasizing the words just enough to make it sound like my presence was a burden she was graciously tolerating. I smiled back, because that was what I had trained myself to do. During the first half hour, everything seemed normal, almost suspiciously so. She was overly pleasant, offering me tea, complimenting my dress, asking polite questions about work. It was so unlike her usual behavior that alarm bells started ringing in my mind. I excused myself to use the bathroom just before dinner was served, and when I returned, the first thing I noticed was my tote bag. It had been slightly moved from where I had left it near the dining table chair. Most people probably wouldn't have noticed, but I did. My line of work had trained me to notice details. The angle of the strap had changed. The zipper was not exactly where I remembered leaving it. It was subtle, almost laughably so, but enough to make my instincts flare. Something was wrong. I said nothing. Instead, I calmly took my seat and reached into my bag for my work phone, the one I often used for security testing and remote system checks. My background in IT security had made me more cautious than most people. I had a monitoring application installed on that phone, originally meant for testing camera systems and remote feeds. I opened the app, activated the recording feature, and placed the phone face down near the center of the dining table, angled in such a way that the camera lens would still capture the immediate area around our seats. No one paid any attention. To everyone else, it simply looked like I had set my phone down before dinner. Conversation continued as plates were passed around. My husband talked to his father about work. His brother discussed some travel plans. My mother-in-law complimented the food. And all the while my sister-in-law sat there with that serene expression, smiling occasionally in my direction, as if we shared some private joke. About halfway through dinner, she suddenly froze. Her hand flew dramatically to her purse. Her expression changed in an instant from calm to alarm. "My wallet," she said sharply. "Where is my wallet?" The room fell silent. Everyone looked up. She began patting around her chair, her lap, the table, her handbag. Her breathing became louder, deliberately panicked. "I had it with me when I came in," she said, her voice rising just enough to draw maximum attention. Then her eyes turned toward me. I knew that look. It was too deliberate, too rehearsed. My stomach tightened. But instead of fear, I felt something colder. Clarity. "Did anyone go near my bag?" she asked, though her gaze never left me. Before anyone could answer, she stood up. "Actually," she said slowly, "I think I know where it is." She moved around the table toward me, every step theatrical. The room held its breath. My husband frowned in confusion. His parents looked startled. She reached down toward my tote bag with a dramatic slowness that made it obvious this moment had been planned. Her fingers slipped inside, and a second later she pulled out her wallet, holding it high like some kind of evidence. Gasps erupted around the table. My husband stared at me in disbelief. His mother covered her mouth. His father's face darkened. My sister-in-law looked at me with false hurt and triumph, carefully mixed together. "I can't believe you would do this," she said softly, shaking her head as if she were the one betrayed. For one suspended moment, everyone looked at me as though I had become a stranger. And then something happened that none of them expected. I laughed, not a nervous laugh, not an embarrassed one, a real laugh. Quiet at first, and then sharper. My sister-in-law's expression flickered. That was the moment she realized something had gone wrong. My husband stared at me. "Why are you laughing?" he asked. I slowly picked up my phone from the table. "Because," I said, my voice steady, "I knew someone touched my bag when I was in the bathroom." I turned the screen toward them and tapped play. The room went silent, except for the faint sound of the recording. The video showed the dining room exactly as it had been 12 minutes earlier. Everyone watched as my sister-in-law glanced around, waited until the others were distracted, then leaned casually toward my chair. Her hand moved with practiced confidence. She unzipped my tote bag, slipped her own wallet inside, and zipped it back up before straightening in her seat as if nothing had happened. The footage was crystal clear. No one could deny it. No one could reinterpret it. The silence that followed was heavier than anything I had ever felt. My husband's face drained of color. His brother looked stunned. My mother-in-law slowly sank back into her chair. My father-in-law stood up so abruptly that his chair scraped loudly against the floor. He took the wallet from her hand and stared at her with a level of disappointment that seemed to strip away every excuse anyone had ever made for her. "Get out," he said coldly. She blinked, still trying to recover. Get out of this room. Now." Her composure shattered. She turned toward me, anger replacing her performance. She needed to be taught a lesson, she snapped. "She acts like she's better than everyone here." Hearing the truth spoken aloud like that was almost surreal. For 3 years she had hidden behind insinuations and carefully chosen words, and now, with proof staring everyone in the face, the mask was finally gone. I looked around the room at the people who had spent years telling me I was imagining things, that I was too sensitive, that I needed to let it go. None of them could look me in the eye. In that moment, the greatest victory was not exposing her lie. It was realizing that for the first time, I was no longer afraid of her. For the rest of that night, the silence inside the house felt heavier than the accusation itself, as if the walls had finally absorbed 3 years of whispered insults, forced smiles, and carefully disguised cruelty, and were now echoing it back to everyone seated at that table. No one moved for several long seconds, after my father-in-law ordered her out of the room. My sister-in-law stood frozen, her face stripped bare of the polished calm she had worn like armor for years, and for the first time since I had known her, she looked cornered. Her eyes darted from one face to another, searching desperately for the familiar allies she had always counted on. The people who had excused her comments, laughed off her behavior, or turned their heads when I tried to explain what she was doing, but no one came to her defense. Her husband looked stunned, almost dazed, as though he had just woken up from a long sleep and found himself in the middle of a nightmare he had helped ignore. My own husband, who had spent years telling me to let things go, stared at the phone in my hand with an expression I will never forget. Shame mixed with disbelief. His mother was the first to speak, her voice trembling as she asked, Has this been going on for a long time?" I looked at her, And in that moment, every swallowed hurt of the past 3 years rose in my throat. I told her yes, it had. I told her about the comments she made about my work, how she constantly mocked my career in IT as if it were something lesser, how she ridiculed our home every time she visited, how every family gathering became an exercise in humiliation disguised as humor. I reminded them of all the times I had tried to say something and had been told I was overreacting, that I was too sensitive, that I needed to learn how to take a joke. With every word I spoke, the room seemed to grow smaller, tighter, filled with the weight of things everyone had chosen not to see. My mother-in-law began to cry quietly, covering her face with her hands, and I could see that for the first time she understood not only what her daughter-in-law had done tonight, but what I had been enduring for years. My husband stood up slowly and walked toward me, but I stepped back before he could touch me. I wasn't ready for comfort from the same person who had dismissed my pain so many times before. That seemed to hit him harder than the video itself. His face tightened, and he nodded, as though he understood exactly why I moved away. Meanwhile, my sister-in-law, no longer able to hide behind false innocence, lashed out in anger. She accused me of trying to embarrass her, of setting her up, of making the whole family turn against her. The irony of that nearly made me laugh again. For years she had worked to isolate me, to make me feel like an outsider, and now that her own actions had been exposed, she suddenly wanted sympathy. My father-in-law's voice cut through the room like thunder when he told her to stop speaking and leave the house immediately. Her husband finally stood and followed her, but not before looking back at me with a face full of regret and confusion, as if he were only now realizing how much damage had been done under his own roof. When the front door slammed behind them, the house fell into a stunned quiet. My husband sat down across from me and after what felt like an eternity, said the words I had waited years to hear. "I'm sorry. I should have believed you." Those words should have felt satisfying, but instead, they landed somewhere between relief and grief. Relief because the truth was finally visible, and grief because it had taken something this extreme for him to see it. He admitted that every time I had brought up concerns about her behavior, he had chosen the easier path, the one that kept the peace in the family and avoided confrontation. He confessed that he had convinced himself it was harmless, because accepting the truth would have meant acknowledging that he had failed to protect me. Hearing him say it aloud broke something open inside me. For so long I had doubted myself, wondering if maybe I really was imagining things, if maybe I had become too defensive, too aware of every tone and glance. But sitting there, listening to him finally admit his failure, I realized how deeply that constant dismissal had affected me. I had started to question my own instincts, my own perception, and that was perhaps the cruelest part of what she had done. My mother-in-law came and sat beside me, tears still in her eyes, and apologized in a way that felt painfully sincere. She said she should have paid attention sooner, that she had seen moments over the years that made her uncomfortable, but chose to overlook them because confronting it would have caused division in the family. She told me she was ashamed that it had taken proof on a screen for her to finally act. My father-in-law, usually a quiet and composed man, looked angrier than I had ever seen him. He apologized too, but his apology was different, less emotional, more resolute. He promised that what happened tonight would have consequences, and that no one in the family would ever again be allowed to treat me that way. For the first time since marrying into that family, I felt seen. Yet even in that moment of vindication, I was exhausted. Years of being undermined, doubted, and isolated had left wounds deeper than one dramatic dinner could heal. Later that night, after everyone had gone home and the dishes remained untouched on the table, my husband and I sat alone in the living room. He asked me why I had never pushed harder, why I had stayed silent for so long. I looked at him and told him the truth, because every time I tried, I was made to feel like the problem. Because when the people closest to you repeatedly tell you that your pain is imagined, you begin to wonder if speaking at all is worth it. He sat there in silence, absorbing every word, and then told me he wanted to make things right, not with promises, but with action. He said he would no longer allow anyone, family included, to disrespect me. He said he would speak to his brother, establish boundaries, and ensure this never happened again. I wanted to believe him, but trust, once fractured, doesn't mend in a single night. Still, there was something different in his voice this time. It wasn't defensive or dismissive. It was ashamed, honest, and determined. The next morning, the fallout began in full force. Calls and messages flooded in from extended family members who had already heard some version of what happened. Some were apologetic, horrified that such a thing had taken place. Others, predictably, tried to minimize it, saying emotions had run high and that perhaps everyone needed time to cool down. But this time, the difference was that I was no longer alone. My husband answered many of those messages himself, making it absolutely clear that what had happened was deliberate and inexcusable. By afternoon, his brother called. His voice sounded strained, as though he had barely slept. He apologized on behalf of his wife, though it was obvious he was still struggling to process the reality of what she had done. He admitted that this wasn't the first time she had manipulated situations to make herself look like the victim, but it was the first time he had seen undeniable proof. That confession sent a chill through me. How many other people had suffered under her games? How many other stories had been quietly rewritten by her before anyone noticed? A day later, a message arrived from her. It was the first honest thing she had ever sent me. There was no sweetness, no performative innocence, no hidden sting, just a blunt apology. She admitted what she had done, though even then there was bitterness beneath the words, as if part of her still resented being caught. She wrote that she had felt threatened by me from the moment I joined the family, that my confidence, my career, and the way the family naturally respected me over time had made her feel replaced. Reading it, I felt no triumph, only clarity. Her cruelty had never truly been about me. It had always been about her own insecurity, but understanding the reason did not erase the damage. In the weeks that followed, family gatherings changed completely. She was still technically part of the family through marriage, but the atmosphere around her shifted. She was no longer the untouchable center of attention she had once been. People watched her words more carefully. Her jokes no longer landed with easy laughter. And when she was polite to me now, it carried a strange edge. Not warmth, not even respect exactly, but caution. She had learned that I would never again be an easy target. More importantly, I had learned something about myself that night. The real victory had not been exposing her lie on video. It had been reclaiming trust in my own instincts. For years, I had let other people's denial make me question what I knew to be true. But now I understood that my perception had never been the problem. The problem had been everyone else's willingness to ignore it. And once that truth settled inside me, something changed forever. I was no longer afraid of her, of the family's judgment, or of being called sensitive. Because once you survive the moment designed to destroy you and walk away stronger, the person who tried to break you loses all power. In the weeks that followed, life did not simply return to normal, because there was no normal left to return to. That Sunday dinner had cracked open years of silence, and once the truth had been dragged into the light, every relationship in the family had to be rebuilt from the ground up. At first, there was an uneasy calm, the kind that comes after a storm when the sky looks clear but the ground is still soaked and unstable beneath your feet. My husband kept his promise in ways I had not fully expected. He stopped asking me to let things go, stopped making excuses for people simply because they shared his blood, and for the first time began putting our marriage ahead of the family image everyone had spent years protecting. He spoke to his brother privately, and whatever was said between them changed something. My brother-in-law, once so willing to laugh off his wife's cruelty as personality, began distancing himself from the endless justifications that had protected her for so long. Family gatherings became smaller, quieter, more deliberate. Invitations now came with the unspoken understanding that if I was uncomfortable, we would leave. That alone was something I had never imagined possible. But healing was not as simple as changed behavior. The real damage had been internal. For years, I had been trained to second-guess myself, to wonder whether the sting I felt after every conversation was real, or just my imagination. I had learned to analyze every word, every glance, every tone, then talk myself out of my own instincts because everyone around me insisted I was being too sensitive. After the exposure at dinner, that habit did not vanish overnight. There were still moments when someone said something harmless, and I felt myself tense, waiting for the hidden insult that never came. There were still nights when I replayed old memories and realized, with painful clarity, How many incidents I had dismissed because I had been taught to doubt my own mind. One evening about a month later, my mother-in-law asked if I would meet her for tea, just the two of us. I agreed, unsure what to expect. She chose a quiet cafe away from the usual family spaces. And the moment I sat down, I could tell this meeting mattered to her. She looked older somehow, as if guilt had aged her in a matter of weeks. She apologized again, but this time it went deeper than before. She told me she had noticed signs over the years, small moments where Sienna's words seemed too pointed, too cruel to be accidental. But every time she considered addressing it, she chose peace over truth. "I failed you," she said, and there was no defensiveness in her voice, only grief. She admitted that the family had spent years protecting the wrong person, because it was easier than confronting the possibility that one of their own was capable of something so calculated. Hearing that did not erase the hurt, but it did something else. It allowed me to stop carrying the burden alone. The blame no longer sat entirely on my shoulders the way it had for so long. Meanwhile, the situation between Sienna and the rest of the family continued to unravel. Her apology message had been only the beginning. Apparently, once her husband confronted her about what happened, more truths began to surface. He discovered that this was not the first time she had manipulated situations to control how others saw someone. There had been lies, half-truths, and carefully staged misunderstandings involving friends and even extended relatives long before I entered the family. What happened to me was simply the first time someone had undeniable proof. That realization sent shockwaves through everyone. The image she had built for years, the charming, graceful woman who always seemed to be at the center of family events, began to collapse under the weight of what people now remembered differently. Conversations that once seemed innocent were being re-examined. Incidents once dismissed as misunderstandings suddenly looked far more intentional. It was as though once one thread was pulled, the entire fabric of her carefully maintained persona started to come apart. Then came the moment that truly marked the end of her power over me. About 6 weeks after the dinner incident, there was a family celebration for my father-in-law's birthday. Everyone was there, including her. The atmosphere was tense from the moment she arrived. She was quieter than usual, overly formal, careful with every word. She approached me while others were distracted, and for a moment I braced myself, old instincts flaring. But instead of the sharp smile I had come to dread, she looked almost uncertain. "Can we talk?" she asked. We stepped aside into the hallway where the noise of the party faded into the background. She stood there for a moment, clearly choosing her words with unusual care. Then she said something I never expected to hear from her. "I hated how easily they accepted you." There it was, the truth laid bare in its ugliest form. She admitted that from the day I joined the family, she had seen me as a threat. My confidence, my relationship with my husband, the way his parents respected me, my career. Even the simple fact that I did not need their approval to know my worth. It had all fueled something bitter inside her. She had spent years trying to make me feel small, because my presence made her feel smaller. Listening to her, I felt something strange, not anger, but distance. For so long, I had imagined this confrontation as something explosive, something emotional, a final showdown years in the making. But standing there, looking at the woman who had caused me so much pain, I felt none of the fear or rage I once thought I would. I simply saw her clearly for the first time, not as some powerful force capable of destroying my peace, but as someone deeply consumed by her own insecurity. I told her calmly that whatever resentment she carried was hers to deal with, not mine to absorb anymore. I told her she no longer had access to my self-worth, my mind, or my peace. For the first time in years, I walked away from a conversation with her without feeling shaken. That was the moment I truly understood what victory meant. It was not about humiliating her, or making the family choose sides. It was about no longer giving her the ability to define how I felt about myself. My husband noticed the change in me too. He told me later that I seemed lighter, freer, as though some invisible weight had finally been lifted, and he was right. For years I had lived in quiet survival mode, preparing myself for the next remark, the next passive-aggressive smile, the next situation where I would be made to feel unwelcome. Now that constant tension was gone. The family dynamic was permanently changed after that. Sienna remained part of the family by marriage, but the balance of power had shifted completely. She was no longer the unquestioned voice people automatically trusted. More importantly, I no longer cared whether she liked me, approved of me, or even spoke to me at all. My husband and I became stronger through the aftermath. Not because the experience itself was good, but because it forced truths into the open that had been ignored for too long. He learned that protecting peace at the expense of his partner is not peace at all. And I learned that my instincts deserve trust even when everyone around me tried to convince me otherwise. Looking back now, I realize the true breaking point was never that wallet or that dinner. It was the moment I stopped being afraid of what would happen if I finally stood in my truth. For years, her manipulation had power only because I feared the consequences of speaking up. Being doubted, dismissed, isolated. But once I faced the worst she could do and survived it, that fear died. What remained was something far stronger than vindication. Certainty. I know now that the real victory was not the video, the apology, or even the family finally seeing the truth. The real victory was reclaiming myself from years of gaslighting and quiet cruelty. She tried to teach me a lesson that night, and in the end, the lesson belonged to me, but not the one she intended. I learned that the moment you stop letting someone else narrate your worth is the moment they lose every ounce of control they ever had over you.